Okay, welcome to the second panel on big wind in the undersea cable. While we're waiting for Lila, perhaps I can start with introductions of the people who are here. This particular panel is going to focus on alternative energy solutions to big wind and the undersea cable. On my immediate left is Robin Kay. Robin is a spokesperson for Friends of Lanai, which has been fighting the imposition of wind power on his island, which would cover 25% of the island. Friends of Lanai is very interested in decreasing our dependence on fossil fuel, and they are a sister island in fighting big wind in the undersea cable. To the left of Robin is Brad Alpert. Brad is the co-owner of Rising Sun Solar. He has a booth inside. Very committed to energy independence and devoted to increasing public awareness of renewable energy and sustainability throughout the state of Hawaii. Brad also co-founded the Hawaii PV Coalition, which is a consortium of businesses and individuals who are dedicated to promoting the use of solar electricity on the panel. Okay, we have here to my right is Lila Berg, three-time state representative in the House, and Lila was a teacher and vice principal on this island at Molokai Intermediate and High School, and she's very interested in empowering citizens and communities to be in the democratic process to affect change in their communities. And to her right is Henry Curtis, who is the director of Life of the Land. Henry's organization is staunchly interested in defending the land through any means necessary, whether it be litigation, education, etc. We're very excited to have all four people here on the panel. Thank you. Okay, let's begin with the fact that a lot of organizations who are opposed to big wind and the undersea cable are often characterized as being anti-green energy. Is this actually the case?
Well, Hawaii's definition of clean energy doesn't exist. Hawaii's definition of renewable energy does not include the word environment, culture, or people. In fact, under state law, you can use coal only and be 200% renewable. This definition was cooked up by the fossil fuel industry. So, in that sense, I do not support renewable energy as defined by the state. Rather, I support real renewable energy as people would use common sense in defining.
Thank you. Oftentimes...
I would add just a,
go ahead,
just a quick second to that. I would encourage all of you to visit Lanai and walk around town, and if you come, let me know and we'll take you out to Keahiakavelo, the site of the proposed wind power plant. But you'll see signs all over town that the ILWU has had printed up and pasted on every property that Castle and Cook owns. And the signs say, wind power to keep Lanai green. And as you all know, just like your proposal here, none of the electricity stays on Lanai. There is nothing green about the industrial wind power plant on Lanai, except the amount of money that Mr. Murdoch would make.
Oftentimes, the wind industry and some in the legislature will say that wind and the cable are necessary because the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative is a mandate that has to be met. Does this have any consequence in this fight?
Henry can answer that better than me, but you know, one of the things we've found out, well, a couple of interesting things about this. Number one, if the energy mandates are not met, the penalty is paid by the HECO shareholders. So the initiative to make those are corporately driven, number one. Number two, it's up to the PUC to apply penalties. There are no mandated penalties for the absence of achievement. So it's a bit awkward to call it a actually we shouldn't use the term mandated. It's not mandated. It's a goal. It's not a law.
The Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative is really not clean, not an initiative, and not even Hawaii. It's two people who came up with a way of selling a package to make sure the utility made a lot of money. Theoretically, it's that we should be 30% efficient and 40% renewable by 2030, but that's slogans only. It has nothing to do with reality. And even if you believe that what they claim they want to do is real, the off-ramps, the loopholes, and the escape clauses, you could drive 5 Mack trucks side by side through. There are so many ways that it is flawed.
And so my voice, from having been inside government, I guess I would want to share with you that it's very complicated. And those of us who are in that building trying to make decisions on a number of different things, realistically, it takes a lot of time and effort and support from people who we would trust for us to pay attention to an issue, and more importantly, to decide on that issue with more than someone saying vote yes or no. So this Clean Energy Initiative, I believe, even though I have gentlemen who will explain its genesis, and it was perhaps engineered, for those of us in elected office, we believe that there needs to be a vision for the state. There needs to be a policy. There needs to be some guideposts and some direction that we want to not only guide our decision, but we want to take our state. And I think it was that particular Clean Energy Initiative idea was very sexy at the time. It was very coherent with what was going on nationally. And this is why these kind of gatherings are important across the state, so that you can ask the questions, what does it really mean? And force elected officials to ask that same question. What are you talking about?
Okay, Henry would like to add something, and then we'll get to Brad.
One of the proposals by Hawaiian Electric was that we should chop down tropical rainforests, kill off the endangered species, displace the native communities to grow palm oil, to turn into biodiesel to power our generators. The Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative states that Hawaii should advocate for federal tax credits to support such an endeavor.
Hi, so I also represent Hawaii Solar Energy Association, and just as an introduction to myself, Hawaii PV Coalition is active, but HSCA is really the organization currently that's lobbying and helping to set policy in the state. And that if you're interested after this forum, you can always get information at hsca.org. That said, I have a little bit different view. I feel like, I moved here. I'm not native to here, and I moved here in 2002 and started my business in 2003, and I've seen nothing but progress, albeit uphill progress, meaning we had to work hard to get to where we are. But I think that if I were to characterize the Clean Energy Initiative, as it was a little bit the cart before the horse. So we said, we're going here. This is the idea. And now what's happening here today and within PUC dockets and other things is like, well, how are we actually going to make this work? But I do believe that by 2030 we'll achieve those goals. The question is, will those goals benefit this community the right way? Will we choose the right combination of resources? And so I think we're somewhere along that journey, and it's people like all you in the community and other people that are in government or are in special interest groups that are going to form the decisions.
Thank you. We often read reports that wind is intermittent, it's unpredictable, and this contests the industry's claim of projected outputs of energy from these turbines. So please explain this in lay terms, why wind is not the best way to go.
I don't necessarily oppose wind, but I think that categorically oppose wind. But currently, for your house, for your home, for your own pocketbook, putting solar on your house is a much better decision financially for you, and putting up a large wind farm is not probably going to benefit you as much. So as far as that goes, I don't know if that answers your question, but there's less impact to the land when you put a solar system on an existing building versus siting a giant wind farm somewhere else. And I think like what solar, we call ourselves like the solar community believes, is that you should be generating power that you use on site and try and use less power in your day-to-day life. And I think that's probably something that's, that mirrors Hawaiian values, that mirrors, Molokai community values, is like, don't use more than you need and try and provide for it yourself where you live.
There's a couple of numbers that may help answer that question. The state claims that big wind will operate at a 40% efficiency. That means that while it's rated at 400 megawatts, only 40% of that will actually be produced. Because on a day like today, the windmills wouldn't be blowing, or very, very slightly. For the last week on Lanai, there's been no wind at all, so there would have been no wind power generated. So the state claims a 40%. The national standard is 19%. So everybody's playing with these numbers. The state says that the 400 megawatts will provide 20% of Oahu's electricity. We think it will provide less than 10%. And in fact, that number was the first number given to the community by a state executive, Ted Peck, who said at the time it was going to be less than 10%. So everybody uses different numbers. The main issue in intermittency is that the wind doesn't blow all the time. As you all know, there are lots of times when it's just not happening.
So what steps could we take to make Oahu
answer
more
that quickly?
self-sufficient?
You're not awake all the time, but you enjoy the time you're awake. So I would say intermittent is not necessarily bad, and we don't oppose wind. We think that all forms of renewable energy have places where they're good and times when they're good, and they all have places where they're not good. Industrial scale wind farms, wind power plants placed on land that will destroy land, that will impact local communities. This project is bad. We do not oppose all wind projects, even in Hawaii. South Point is 60 to 75% efficient. It is perhaps the most efficient wind farm in the world.
And if I might add a different perspective, I think we need to talk about the system. We're discussing whether wind is good or bad, whether the turbines should be here or should not. I mean, it's very clear the turbines should not be on land for a number of different reasons. If we continue to speak about wind in absentia, or without talking about the system, then we run the risk of creating controversies with the solar industry, with environmentalists, with people who will say, well, you don't care about Oahu. I mean, there are many different angles to this, but I would urge all of us, when you're asking the questions about the pros and cons of wind energy, to continue to anchor it to an existing system in which the utility is the generator. Utility company is the generator, not the distributor. And as long as, especially on Molokai and Lanai, and now even on the Big Island, talking about geothermal, when the source into the cable, regardless of what it is the focus of a community's concern, without talking about the cable, then that becomes a weapon, if you will, to divide communities. I think we're going to see a lot more conversation, unless there's clarity on what means renewable or free energy, that's going to try and move communities to be against each other. We've experienced that on a number of issues. Super Ferry, for example. It was devastating when I was in the legislature how the conversation about this one company succeeding did not include the larger conversation about whether or not we need an inter-island transport system. So the bigger questions that have to be asked really are going to have to come from you. They're not generated in the square building in Honolulu. And maybe that's an introduction for questions.
Absolutely.
I'd like to ask, to anchor it down like you suggested, what steps can we all take to make Oahu more self-sufficient, because all of the big wind energy is supposedly going to go from Lanai and Molokai to Oahu?
I've been told that you have to ask a tourist whether there's sunshine in Waikiki, because the utility will claim there are no roofs available for solar, but there are all these tourists on the beach sunning themselves. For some reason, Hawaiian Electric can't find the sun on Oahu, they can't find the wind, they can't find the waves, and they say you have to supply it to them because we lack the resources. The resources are lacking in the leadership of Hawaiian Electric.
One of your residents described going to a meeting in Honolulu and having to go to the bathroom before the meeting began. And so he went, as he approached the bathroom, the door opened with electricity. The toilet flushed with electricity. The water, the soap for his hands came out with electricity. The water went on with electricity. And then the door closed with electricity. And he said, Molokai, you got to take a pee, excuse me, you go out back. But his point was really well made. We so abuse our electricity, all of us, but mostly on Oahu, where you can't even open the windows in in all of the hotels. So we need to talk about conservation, no question about it. And I just want to say one other thing that I heard here that was such a wonderful commentary. A couple of meetings ago, we were at a public testimony to the state, and someone from Molokai stood up and said, you know, Molokai's got a water shortage, but we haven't asked Oahu to pipe their water over to us.
Come from Hawaii.
Brad, would you like to address any of the solar projects that you're familiar with that are occurring on Oahu right now, some of the larger ones?
They just approved Tier 3 feed-in tariff, and for those of you who don't know what a feed-in tariff is, there's a law that was passed roughly just over a year ago that allows a developer to build a solar farm, or a wind farm for that matter, and sell power to directly to the utility company at a fixed rate for 20 years. And so Tier 1 and Tier 2 were approved, which were relatively small size systems. Just over the Christmas holiday, Tier 3 was approved. So I believe a lot of larger solar projects are going to be getting built this year. And those, again, are more centralized in scale, but still limited and a lot smaller than these wind projects that are being discussed. The other thing that's happening is there's just literally like a viral movement within residential solar happening, where everyone's deciding to go solar because it's cheaper to go solar. And unfortunately, here on Molokai, the grid has been effectively shut down for months in a lot of the circuits, and that's also about to change. At the end of last year, Rule 14H was changed to look at circuits differently, and a grid-wide study on Molokai was conducted, and the results of that study should be out soon, and I would expect that we would be able to more than double the number of rooftops that are allowed to have solar on Molokai this year.
And maybe I can ask a question, because Greg framed this from the inquiry of what's going on Oahu. We are here, but you're here also, I believe, to send a message to Oahu that there are alternatives on this island that could make this island self-sufficient, if that really is the dream. So, and you have some ideas, I know, Henry, as we've been talking over the years, on the possibility and reality that every island could be self-sufficient. May I segue the question away from Oahu to here at home? Some examples of how the examples here could be used as a pivot point for the neighbor islands.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to back up, and I didn't speak to the last question so directly, but I think the issue isn't so much solar versus wind, it's siting the projects, and it's the undersea cable that's really in question. For the amount of money that's going to be spent on the undersea cable, and then the risk that that cable poses to both to the environment, but just risk in terms of what if that cable was to break or malfunction. Money could be better spent to enhance the grid here to allow this island to be 100% renewable, for Lanai to become 100% renewable, and for Oahu to manage its own resources effectively and have a better grid that was more reliable. So if you just looked at the money that's going to be spent on the cable, forget about a wind farm. That's the resource, or that's the funds that should be looked at. How could we spend that differently? I don't know if that's what you were asking, but...
There's been talk on this island of how Molokai can set up a community-based utility co-op as an alternative to HECO, and I know Henry has some ideas in that realm.
If you look at Kauai Island for a moment, they have a co-op, and a co-op can be formed to be a competing utility. Right now, they have the grid. But if you focus on building smart buildings, which means putting solar water heaters and photovoltaic panels at every home, and having like these 8-foot wind towers that go like this, that are non-intrusive, looking at the water delivery systems, there are ways of gaining power as the water flows down. It's called in-stream flow within the drinking water supply that does not impact the drinking water. You have enormous amounts of water flowing down from the streams on the windward side. You can make buildings as energy independent as possible. By doing it through a co-op, the co-op would say, we're going to finance that, and we would like grants and loans to enable us to do that. There's a company, Pacific Biodiesel, which in the mid-1990s set up, they went to the Maui landfill and they started converting waste products to biodiesel. Recently, they operated, they're building a new biodiesel plant on the Big Island with local crop production. People have asked, how did they do it so quickly? One, they didn't show up until they were invited. Two, they were willing to get crops from other people's production. So Pacific Biodiesel could, if invited, come here and generate local biofuels, biodiesel, from local crop production. Now, if you incorporate an idea that the Japanese are doing, which is after their nuclear plant shut down, the local car companies are coming up with a way of taking a power cord from a hybrid or electric vehicle so they can have rice cookers from their car, basically. So Pacific Biodiesel could be powering vehicles, and the vehicles could be supplying additional power to the homes when the homes have shortfalls of power from the hydro, from the wind, from the solar on site. So basically, you'd be saying to the MECO, thank you for your grid, but we don't need it. You could separate from the grid house by house, building by building, to the point where MECO would say, my God, we're going to have all these stranded assets that we have no use for. We better sell them to the Molokai co-op before they're worthless. That would send a huge shock wave to MECO and HECO, because with rising prices, if more and more communities said, well, why should we stay connected to your grid? Why don't we form co-ops and leave your grid? The utility would begin to freak out and say, maybe we shouldn't be pissing off our customers. So that's one approach.
At the previous panel, we ran out of time and didn't have a chance to have the audience participate in this discussion, so we would love to do that now. But first I want to share a quote with you from an editorial in Forbes magazine from July 19th, 2011. Forbes magazine, always a friend to big business. And the editorial ended with, quote, "The wind energy business is an over-subsidized industry that depends wholly on taxpayer dollars to remain solvent while providing an inferior product to consumers that does little, if anything, to reduce our need for hydrocarbons or cut carbon dioxide emissions." So let me go down here, and please, anyone who would love to ask a question, I'll be down there and give you the microphone, and they would love to talk to you up here.
Aloha, Curtis,
Aloha.
and Ms. Berg, Kay, and Albert. This is directed to Curtis and Ms. Berg. This is kind of out of the box, knowing that with history that there is no annexation papers that is found, and we know that there is no annexation to the state. So with the executive agreement that our president agreed with Queen Liliuokalani to administer kingdom law, how would that affect if throwing in a wrench, knowing that from the Ahakioli the thing turned into the Interior Ministry and then turned into the DLNR, knowing that the DLNR is de facto, that would it be possible that you can actually get the President of the United States to intervene because he's not administering Kingdom of Hawaii law? Correct me if I'm wrong. For intervening on such a using the sources for the West End or for the state, how would that be able? Am I in an area that maybe you can shed light on?
Well, let's run with that. If you want to make Molokai sustainable, and you're going to have your own cooperative to produce your own power, and you're producing both your electricity and your biofuels, and you're then wanting to seek agencies who will help you reestablish your independence, basically. And you have OHA, who is against the cable, and you have DHHL, who has land and money. Perhaps Molokai could reestablish itself as the breadbasket, showing how an independent Hawaii would operate.
I'm a little uncomfortable with that word breadbasket. You mean like model?
Well, no, Molokai was originally the breadbasket of the independent kingdom.
Okay, I'll skip over that comment. If your question is whether the current reality of Hawaii being occupied has an impact on any of these decisions and the role that the President of the United States would play, federal government and funding, I'd probably say no. It's complicated, but at the same time, it's clear to some of us. I am not really an elected official, or I wasn't, because we're not really a state. However, I was. So I think the different question is, how can we utilize and how can we use where we are now in history to ensure, number one, that Molokai can be sovereign in its decisions as to how energy is to be distributed and generated? That's number one question. And the second question is where we are in this point in history with no clear definition on whether Hawaii, I mean, there's some who agree it's occupied, some agree it's not. We have a lot of work that needs to be reconciled and a lot of clarity that needs to be brought. But there's also people on the international level that are finding ways to recognize Hawaii once again as the sovereign nation that it has always been. So that second question is, how in the international court or in the international arena can we utilize the existing policies and sentiments toward sovereign nations to enable Molokai to make its decisions on how energy is generated and distributed? I would venture to suggest to you that when I first got elected, it was kind of an emotional time, and maybe this is information that you can share, that you can utilize on Molokai. The legislature is skittish about anything having to do with Hawaiians. Hawaiians genetically, Hawaiians living on Hawaiian land, those of us who, and I am not native Hawaiian, I'm native Hawaii. So it's a wonderful opportunity right now to take advantage of the confusion and also the willingness that some people have in our elected offices to bring clarity. That's kind of a roundabout way of saying that in 2005, the state legislature was the only legislature in the nation, and even before the United States, agreed to adopt the UN draft of the Convention of the Rights of Indigenous People. It didn't mean much to the President of the United States at the time, but it was a statement from Hawaii that this document, to which the United States needed to sign on to, which it has now under President Obama, is a bona fide declaration of the rights of indigenous people. In that declaration, it talks about the ability to make decisions regarding environment, culture, the well-being of its people, of our people. So I think there are a number of different approaches that we can take to substantiate and to make sure that Molokai's voice is heard and in fact ignites other communities to have their voices heard in the larger conversation of what role do citizens play in a representative democracy. You know, we're very fortunate we have Mele who listens. But when Mele stands up, Representative Mele Carroll, when she stands up and says, my district, my constituents don't want this or want that, she's one voice, and maybe some of the other neighbor island representatives will support that. It's not enough. And so what I brought along that I wanted to share with you, because I don't know how much time we have, is in the Poli Center, there's a small directory of elected officials. And I encourage you to take that directory home with you. Even if you never want to talk to anybody in Honolulu, you at least know you can. You know that movie, Ghostbusters? Who You Gonna Call? That book shows you who you can call. And I'm going to invite you to just randomly pick anyone that you can call. Mele knows how you feel. You don't need to inundate her email or her mailbox or her office. She knows. She needs support so that she can continue to have that voice. And I would encourage you to work with the folks who are in the international arena as well, because Molokai is not unknown to the international world.
Thank you. Who would like to speak next?
I'm going to go back to the nuts and bolts of the idea about the co-op. I've lived off the grid for 20 years. Well, I've lived off the grid for longer than that, but I've had actually solar power for 20 years. And there's a lot of maintenance of the batteries. We've had to replace the batteries a couple of times. And that's a big expense. So there's a bottleneck with solar, if you're off grid, of storage. So when you're talking about doing small scale solar, buildings, then the question that comes to me is, well, what's the plan for storage? Because there's got to be some form of storage of energy, otherwise you can't run lights at night.
The two forms of storage would be, one, that the hydro always runs and you can always rely on it for hydropower. The second is that the car would have biofuel in it, biodiesel, that could always be turned on to supplement. The purpose of the co-op is right now there's a great deal of money being talked about this super duper grid, the smart grid, where everything is computerized, and Hawaiian Electric would be able to tell your instantaneous change of energy use in every building in the state. That is one model of super centralization. The other model is to have a co-op focus on raising funds to provide the technical expertise, the maintenance workers, the service workers, to bring about smart buildings and smart communities. And therefore, it would be taking the expertise we have in this community and putting it in a group to make sure that Molokai's money stays circulating within Molokai. I think there would be a lot of interest around the world in saying, is there an alternative to the super duper grid, and can we go a more self-reliant method, but not put the onus on each individual, but rather the community comes together with an entity that is community-driven that brings about this transformation.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Well, I would agree that, you know, trying to power each building in isolation or even small communities may be challenging, and I don't know that I am totally signed on to Henry's idea, but I think if Molokai wanted to, you know, form a utility co-op and make an offer to the utility, I don't know that this is a huge profit center, nor is Lanai, and I'm not really so sure that they wouldn't take the offer. I can't guarantee that that's going to mean lower rates. I mean, Kauai has the highest rates in the state, even though they're a co-op. So, or maybe Molokai's right there with them. But they have more customers, so in theory they should have lower rates. And they have a pretty good hydro resource as well. I think the opportunity for you, like I said, is to try and create power on site for yourself, try and use less power. And then I think right now there's actually a huge opportunity for Molokai to become the example for distributed solar, or for distributed solar and energy efficiency. There's a study that was paid for by the U.S. Department of Energy to see how much more solar could be added to the grid. And before long, this grid will have more solar, probably in terms of distributed solar, than any place else in the country. And I think as battery technology and other things advance and grid technology advances, you know, the utility doesn't need to know your every move. What they need to realize is they don't need to know your every move, and they can look at other drivers and be able to, you know, manage the grid effectively. So I don't know that taking over the utility company on Molokai is going to be a boon for Molokai utility rates. It might be that you could more effectively manage the decisions that are being made. And I just think that it's clearly the wrong decision to put an undersea cable in a giant wind farm on Molokai.
We've been, in certain areas of Molokai, been cut off from tying into the grid. I think there's a 15% cap now. HECO's generators and, I guess, equipment is aging. So I was wanting to address this question to Henry. In terms of, you know, going back to having our own utility and purchasing access to the grid, would we even want to do that? Because the equipment is aging, and I'm wondering, or is there a way to set it up entirely yourself?
Well, for example, one of the problems with solar is it produces most of its power in the middle of the day, and it tends to die down in the evening. So you come home from work, you want to turn on your appliances, the solar isn't running as effectively. If part of it is that you have reservoirs and lakes in different parts of Molokai, and you can actually pump water between them. You pump up when you have excess solar or wind or whatever, and you drop it when you need it. So pump storage is the #1 way of transferring large amounts of energy over hour periods, like from morning to evening or something like that. So I would talk about where you'd want the distribution lines, but you would not want the generators. You would not want the fossil fuel generators. You want to keep all of the power production within the island so that all of the money is basically you're paying yourself. You're not outflowing it for something. And by keeping the money circulating within the island, it's like a rock being dropped in a pond. It's being rippled through other sectors of the island. And that's the model.
Follow up on that, please. I know the batteries are really a big issue and a long problem for storage. Is it possible or feasible that an independent person could do the pump storage? What size tank would you need, and what size little... I know guys out here that were living off of a stream where they had a little hydro generator. Is it possible you could put up 3,000 or 4,000 gallons a day and do anything?
It's possible, and I wouldn't rule that out. Normally, you need a drop, which causes the energy to be generated. And it's the size of the drop. It's the size of the water drop and the force of the water. It would be more efficient to do it on a slightly larger scale, but I wouldn't rule out the smaller systems.
I think battery technology, at least for your home, is already there if you wanted it. It's not like out of reach, but I don't think pump storage for a home or even a small community is really the answer. For a grid or on a more industrial scale, like Henry's saying, I think it's more effective. But what I would say is that, like, the problem that's going on right now is the large focus of this conversation, to a degree, is about the wind farm that shouldn't be built. And I just remember a long time ago there was a movie called Who Killed the Electric Car, right? And politicians were talking about the hydrogen economy, and all my colleagues were saying the hydrogen economy does not make sense. And they gave me all these reasons. I was like, wow, that does make sense. What are all these guys talking about hydrogen for? And my company was hired to go put a solar array in a building on the Big Island. And it was this giant solar array, but the purpose of the building was to educate people about the hydrogen economy, which never happened. And really, the building should have had an electric car charging station and been focused on charging electric cars. So what happened was, for about 10 years, we were completely distracted who engineered this, and the discussion was always about the hydrogen economy. And that same thing is happening now. Now, you need to stop the wind farm from happening, but you need to focus on what the discussion really needs to be, which again is grow your food here, make your power here, use less power, and be as self-sufficient as possible. And that's going to be the way forward.
Anyone else? Oh.
Okay, I had a question on the biofuel. How much land are you talking about for, and what type of fuel are we growing? This is plant. Okay, what type of plant are we growing?
Pacific biodiesel varies. The plants vary by what is grown within a region. For example, I was talking to Kelly King the other day, and she said that Molokai is growing kukui for kukui oil. There are different crops and different types that can be used. It might be that the crop used in one section of Molokai is different than a crop in another section of Molokai. The Pacific biodiesel model is that you build local, small-scale facilities that are very community-friendly, and they even have models where they've allowed co-ownership or ownership of the plants that they've built. So they want to build sustainable systems. The exact acreage, I would defer to them.
Okay, second question. We have the reputation of not in my backyard syndrome right now. And if we were to, on a large scale, say we took the land that they plan on building all these windmills on, if we took that amount of space and we grew biofuel, could we help out the neighbor islands with their energy?
I would hope you would not think about taking a large-scale industrial plant of one type and turning it into a large-scale industrial plant of another type. I would hope they would be more interested in seeing whether you could grow crops in your front yard to support somebody down the street.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear.
Okay.
That's exactly. So if we were to be the model and get this going, is there space, I guess this would go to you, Lila, is there space on Oahu for them to adapt the same type of system, or is this something that would mainly go for smaller islands?
I'm not sure why you think that's my question. We have a lot of room on all islands. It's, again, goes down to the question of vision and what do we want for Hawaii? What do we want for Hawaii as a state? What do we want to feel like, look like, how we want to evolve? And every island has its own kuleana to steward that vision as well. You know, I think some of the key questions that we all need to ask as citizens is, in this fervor and this mantra to save the planet's oil sources, are our decisions to reduce oil usage or are our decisions about reducing the cost of electricity? Those are two different questions. And so it's very complicated, and I think probably to keep it as focused as possible for this event, and maybe, I don't know where Kanoho is, to suggest that the next steps for Aloha Molokai is to continue to have informational sessions, maybe another festival. I know he's going to kill me if he hears this.
This is the first.
This is the first annual, maybe the first biannual. But, you know, occasions where we can come together, talk to normal people, not the talking heads who represent corporations, and have the really authentic discussions that we need to have so that we as community people can decide what's best for our community. Your comment about not in my backyard, that's Hawaii Kai's mantra. Not in Hawaii Kai, that's the North Shore on Oahu. We don't want shark tours in our backyard. It's not about our backyard because we all steward each other's backyard. And I think that's the whole point of the phrase Kealopono, which is emanating from Molokai, that we will take to our other conversations. So I don't know if I answered your question. I think we have to be very deliberate.
You answered it like a politician.
Oh, okay.
This cell phone has a power plant in it that provides power for it. So it's not that we don't want power plants in our yard or our house. It's what type.
Okay, I have a question in regards to what would happen health-wise in our environment, in our community, and who would end up fitting the bill behind that. Because up in Mauna Loa, if they take place and people do get these debilitating illnesses, they cannot work, more people continue to lose their jobs, more people are getting sick, more people are going to be violent, more people are going to need special education. Who fits that bill? Because as it stands, they're saying, well, I don't want to say they, but Abercrombie stated that he puts in, or the state puts in more money towards Molokai than we put out. Wouldn't it increase the amount of help that Molokai would need?
That's a rhetorical question. Of course it would. And so how can we reframe the question for the governor to ask it differently? You know, there continues to be discussion on Oahu about how much money we're spending outside for others. We need to shift that conversation. In fact, not even shift it. We need to change that. It's not about others. I mean, Molokai is perfectly generous in every island is generous in offering its location for people to come and visit. We just don't want people to stay all the time, especially if they don't have the mana'o and they don't have the aloha that we're willing to extend to them. And this transcends genetics or ethnicities. It's about human beings. And so what I believe this event and what each of you can do is bring the humanness of decisions to those decision makers on Oahu and make this effort, this battle, real to them. It's not a paper battle. This is real. And it's corporation. It's a corporation versus the people.
Aloha Molokai.
Aloha.
Very thankful for all your panelists up there. But yeah, the whole problem here is that we can't handle Molokai. We can take care of it because we already are doing it. The problem we're having is that they want us to furnish Honolulu, the underwater cable. I mean, we can have windmills if we want to. We didn't have to be big like the one they expected us to have on the west end. You know? But the cable is the problem. That's the biggest problem. I don't care how you guys go around and around. The problem is that cable. And the cable is that if they want to build, that's what they ask for, that's what they get. Over here in Molokai, we cannot afford all that. Right now we're paying the highest water. Everything on the Molokai is very expensive. And it ain't going to go down. It's going to keep going up. And so for us, the Molokai, we're simple. The thing is that we're the friendly island. Nowadays, we ain't going to be any friendlier. They're making us unfriendly because everything that they have to offer us is something that we cannot afford. So this is our problem. If they want to live that way, then they find alternatives to suit their lifestyle. That's what I say to myself and to Molokai. You know, we don't have to be burdened with somebody else's problem. If you ask for the problem, then you solve the problem. So I'm really happy you guys are here. But you know, it's easy. Talk is cheap. But the lives that live here is the one that tells the story. A lot of the people that move here is because they have been treated that way outside. And we're blessed, Molokai. We're not asking for anything that is not already ours. So I needed to share that. We love Molokai. From the east to the west, the north to the south, that's ours. And we're not divided by water. And we Kupunas, we get together because we know if we don't set up our young ones, they're not going to have nothing. It's already been taken away. So this is why I needed to come here and listen first before I get to share. My story never changed. God bless us so much. Molokai, we're spoiled, you know, and it's about time we come out here and say what we want to say and say it because they need to know. All on the other islands, they need to know. Shelter for yourself what you can afford. If you cannot afford it, then don't get it. So I needed to share. I love all you guys. Mahalo.
I think, Auntie, what you just said, Auntie, if I could apply all that ditto to Lanai, it is a community that is severely challenged right now by an incredibly divisive conversation. Families won't talk to each other anymore. Brothers and sisters are on different sides of it and will not talk. Violence has begun to erupt in the community. And yet, underneath it all, is this great love for this incredibly beautiful island. And we have to find a way to remind people that that's really what's at stake. It's not about the wind, and it's not about the green. It's about a community that's being ripped apart for one man and a couple of government officials' desire to make a lot of money for this one man. So thank you for that, Auntie. It's very applicable to the Lanai community as well.
Thank you, Greg. My question and comments are for the community as well as for the panel. That we brought up the idea of the system, that maybe we could grow crops, but the crops need to be watered, so we have to have water. And we would like to store energy using the water, but we need the solar during the day. So the whole system has to come together. Not only that, but we have transportation is another real question. How do we get around on the island? How do we get from this island to other islands? And we want to address all of these as a system. One of the suggestions that came from a person by the name of Cal, he works for the County of Maui. I can't forget what his last name is.
Kobayashi.
Thank you, Kobayashi. He suggested that one of the ways that we could store energy is with the batteries of the electric cars, so that during the day you charge the batteries of the car, and then during the night they're all hooked up to the system, and then you can begin to take energy from the batteries in the car. It's another way to store energy, as well as pumping water when you have an excess of solar or wind energy. So it's just a suggestion, something for us to think about here on the island of Molokai.
Cal Kobayashi is one of the 3 or 4 greatest energy thinkers in the state in terms of the breadth and depth of his knowledge, and he's truly a blessing for the state.
Hi, everyone. There's a website, it's Alcohol Can Be a Gas, and it's made just from refuge. And you don't have to plant anything. It's the leftover parts of the crop that's not used is distilled. And you can actually put half a tank of that alcohol in most cars and half a tank of gas. And I think it's only like $100,000 to get started in that little business. And another thought that came to me too was that a co-op, electrical co-op, could co-op the batteries and all the different parts and buy them all up and store them, and when people need them, they would be able to get them at a lower price.
I envision also they could actually be buying the hybrid cars and electric cars to replace the fleet on Molokai, so that you'd be having more efficient cars, and you'd be buying them in bulk, cutting down heavily on the price, so that you'd be solving both the electricity and the transportation issues, keeping the money from... I went down and saw the price of gasoline at your local gas station, where the diesel is like $5.03, keeping the money here instead of outflowing it. So solving both electricity and transportation issues in one shot. And getting OHA, who doesn't like the cable, to put up some money for the vehicles.
I think that if anything comes out of this energy conference, might be that you form a small group of people and start applying for some grants. Like I said, you've already gotten one. And I think that the size and shape of Molokai really lends itself to the electric car industry proving itself here, to having electric car charging stations around the island. You don't really need that many of them anyway. I'm part of a group on Maui that is part of this electric vehicle initiative. There's money there from different sources to put up these charging stations. And I think all it would take, again, is like kind of inviting it here to Molokai to get some more federal funds to start to move in that direction. When Henry or different people say, what about this idea? And we only need $100,000 for that. Well, that's still a lot of money. And a lot of these technologies are not refined. Like the whole idea of electric cars charging being a source of power for your home at night is a model that's been discussed but never proven. It could happen on Molokai. or it could start to be proven on Molokai. And that's, and the model makes a lot more sense the higher the energy costs. So you have an advantage here to prove the model just in fact because your energy costs so much. And so I think I would say, like, try and form some small group and then decide what your greatest achievable priority would be first, and go after some money and start to move in those directions, because I think you'll get it. I mean, I know from just talking to a lot of people and being out there that everyone highly respects Molokai and wants to, like, help the community in Molokai as best they can, and that goes for legislators as well.
Okay, yeah, Adolf Helm. I just have a question regarding, perhaps it's a good segue to Matt's discussion on grants, subsidies, tax incentives, et cetera, et cetera. I recently fortunate enough to put in a PV system thanks to Matt's company, Rising Sun, that installed it this past December. So I'm looking forward to my tax return. But saying that, those are the incentives for homeowners like myself and others to really pursue that idea of being self-sufficient as far as energy is concerned. But on the bigger scale, from the corporations and the big companies that are relying on these incentives that the federal government is, providing. Can you guys shed light on, I guess when you look at factors that mitigation factors to get these companies, these large-scale companies, to not put in large-scale industrial wind farms? How does the tax incentive, does it rely so heavily on that for these companies to actually pursue these kind of developments and proposal? Because I guess I'd like to know, if those tax incentives weren't there, would these companies move forward with this renewable large-scale projects?
No, and we've sat through meetings with Castle & Cook where we asked the question, if the 65% subsidies disappeared, would this project go away? And they said yes. It's a 30% grant. They flip the switch, they get 30% of the cost of the development as a grant. Then there's an additional 35% as a tax credit. Now, the tax grant was not extended this year. In the 2-month session that Congress passed a 2-month budget, if you will, and the federal tax grant was not extended. The tax credit doesn't expire until the end of this year. So it's possible when they come back to do the next 10 months, they could continue to not extend the production tax credit of the 30%, I'm sorry, the production tax grant of 30%. And if they stop the credit, if both of those disappeared, I would bet you anything, Adolf, that it would not happen on Lanai. I can't speak for Molokai and Pattern / First Wind / whoever, but Castle & Cook would not do it. It's when Castle & Cook did the solar farm, their tax credits were incredible. They made money. As best as we can figure out, it was a $19 million project, and they got $24 million in tax credits when they flipped the switch. Now that's your money. So I think the short answer is no, it wouldn't happen. I want to add something separate from Adolf's question, that I want to go back to something Lila said, because I think it's really, really, really important. It's very important that you each, on a regular basis, write a letter to a legislator. As she said, it doesn't have to be Melly, it doesn't have to be Kalani or Mike Gabbard or Denny. They've heard you clearly. But the other legislators do not know what's going on. And it's not that they're stupid, it's that there's so much else on their plate. And through much of Lila's suggestions to me, I've gone to legislators that they're not my constituents, it's Hawaii, well, not Hawaii Kai, but Kalihi or other communities, and they've asked really good questions because we've written them really good independent letters. So I would urge all all of you to write a letter a week to a different legislator, and you don't need a form letter, just a personal letter expressing what it is that concerns you, and you'd be surprised if you get a response back that's an instant opening to expand their knowledge. So you really should do that. All of you should be writing letters and calling, and when you go to Honolulu, I would urge you to go and visit legislators that are not yours, because they are yours.
And to punctuate that, I think I've been punctuating it all day, right, people? You are very, very fortunate to have a gentleman and his wife like Robin, who are willing at their own expense to take this issue on. You're also very fortunate to have so many of you within your community that are willing to go individually. Margaret Mead said that we should never underestimate the power of the concerned citizen to change society, because it has been indeed the only thing that's ever changed society. I paraphrased it a little bit, but I think you get the gist that it's more than an invitation. It is a plea to not just be involved, but actually email, write, call, just use someone else's cell phone if you don't want to use your cell phone and have the caller ID indicated at the Capitol. But even a phone call that says, this is your name, you are from this island, and you really wish they would pay attention to the question of the cable. You never know who's going to be on staff that may want to be elected in office next. And I think at the early presentation this morning, Henry had already framed our contribution here with the reality. Every single elected official in the legislature is up for re-election. And while you do not vote for someone from Kalihi, you have cousins, you have friends, you have neighbors, and that's what has to go viral from today forward. Call somebody, connect when you're talking story, when you're in Honolulu, when you're on Maui, when you're on your big island. There has to be a groundswell. You may have heard the song The Many by our young friend Makana, the singer. He sang that song 45 minutes during APEC at the Heads of State dinner. He sang it quietly. He changed the tone a little bit, the key. It was the same song that was calling out for people to rise up, and it was calling for heads of state to be paying attention to people. We don't all have to be screamers and shouters and warriors. We have enough of those. So for those of you who are uncomfortable with confrontation, maybe look at this next period of time, because session is going to start on Wednesday. Decisions will be made by the first week in May. And in reality, it happens the night before session closes. So we have a little bit of time to sculpt resolutions, and there will be one that will be introduced on behalf of the Hawaiian Civic Clubs and instigated by the Ho'olehua Civic Club. We've talked about a number of different other approaches to legislation, but that is only one methodology. If you can unite across the islands other concerned citizens, and maybe the folks on Kauai are not affected yet, but when the pipeline for their water from Waialeale is proposed, they will be coming to you for assistance. So let's bring our families together and start talking about how we can support everybody. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here and for welcoming me home. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I get one question. Aloha. Simple question for simple people. Simple people like me, of course. One of the so-called benefits that HICO had offered the people of Molokai and Lanai was that we would be able to pay the same rates as Oahu. This is my question. Why don't we pay the same rates now? If they're looking at, we are one state, one utility, why don't we pay the same rates as everyone else?
Denny Kaufman has proposed a bill that would actually merge HECO, HELCO, and MECO into one entity and therefore have one rate. Right now, the utility could approach the PUC and say that we have one peoples, we should have one rate. Hawaiian Electric has never proposed that to the Public Utilities Commission. The PUC is not proactive in that way. They're waiting for someone to make that proposal. So Hawaiian Electric could do it with or without the cable.
Kanoho, that's a great question. A couple of comments about rates. HECO keeps telling the people of Lanai that they will levelize Lanai's rates, which are as high, if not higher, than yours. But what they're really not saying is how much. What levelized, to my mind, is that Oahu's rates will go up significantly to pay for the cable, and then to pay for the rate increases. So pretty soon, Oahu's rates will be level with Lanai's. It's not that Lanai's are going down, it's that Oahu's are going up. So be careful in believing what levelized rates mean. I don't see our rates going down at all.
And just to answer your question, each utility company is, although it's owned by a parent company, operates independently, and then the rate is based off of the cost to operate that utility. And somehow they look at Maui, Lanai, and Molokai separately when it's convenient, and then as a group other times. So for instance, with the feed-in tariff, there's a limit to 5% of the total grid should be feed-in tariff projects. And that limit has actually already been reached, but there's no feed-in tariff projects, to my knowledge, or very few on Molokai. So people in Molokai should have the opportunity with their land to build a solar farm or a small-scale wind farm and sell power to the utility. But they've already sort of been closed out because someone on Maui did, but yet you pay higher rates on Molokai than someone on Maui. So I do believe that sharing the cost across all islands would be the most equitable thing to do. It's a novel idea, but it would mean completely restructuring the company, and I do believe there's some advantage the utility has by having separate corporations. And I know that from my experience doing solar projects on all different islands, the rules, the people you deal with, the way that you queue up to get your projects done, it's different on every island. And it's the same thing with permitting your projects through the county. It's different on every island. So I think like homogenizing that to some degree makes sense just intuitively, but actually getting everyone to want to do that is going to be really difficult.
I think one other thing on rates before we drop that issue is that one of the major, quote, benefits, end quote, that's being waved in front of the Lanai community is that our electric rates will go down by 40%. And that's Castle and Cook and HECO making a promise that they really do not have the power to approve, because they do not set our electric rates. They're set by the Public Utilities Commission. And that's a really hard argument for people to understand, because the idea of lowering your rates by 40% is so exciting, but it's just not, it's not in their power to give. So to speak.
And one other point, right now the goal of Hawaiian Electric supposedly is to maximize clean energy. It is not to lower your rates. If instead the approach was, how can we maximize renewable energy while minimizing cost? And we have suggested that to the utility, and they've closed off their ears.
Wouldn't it make for an even larger entity if you merged these three entities, HECO and the other two? It seems like we've lived in a top-down world for a long time, and as evidenced by our Wall Street movement, it seems people are really tired of being handed down decisions from the top. It seems to me my vision for our new world is that we decentralize everything, including, you know, whether it's power or whether it's food as a commodity or whatever. The way we take care of each other and is by taking care of ourselves and people around us. And so it seems to me decentralizing the banks that came through this last debacle were the ones that were co-ops. So when we cooperatively work with each other, it seems like we do the best for each other and for the world. So I just wanted to say that decentralization seems to be the answer to me.
Aloha, my name is Matt Yamashita. Just wanted to ask one question. What is, Molokai, we dealing with these saturated circuits on our island, that 15% limit, and it's been holding a lot of residents back from being able to install solar and to address their own energy needs. I'm just wondering, what do the circuits look like on Oahu? Do you guys have a grip on that?
What's interesting is there are 3 circuits in this state which have penetration levels between 60 and 100%. And the utility is claiming we can't go above 15. And we've been trying to get the information. The Public Utilities Commission has set up a reliability standards working group. We've been trying to get the data from the utility. The utility has been resisting us. And of ironies, 15 parties on that have asked for a tweaking of the process this Thursday's meeting. And one of them on our side is DBED, and another one is Castle on Cook. So everybody is having trouble getting the data from the utility, and we really need to force them to explain why the problem exists and why 15% was arbitrarily chosen.
Well, what I'm wondering is, per circuit, is Oahu as saturated as Molokai?
So if there's how many circuits?
Because
4
I
or
guess
5. There's 4 or 5 circuits.
There's like
on
6 or 7, yeah.
So, and out of those 6 or 7, 3 are saturated on Molokai.
And the other 2 heavily.
Right. And I would say that if you took that percentage and you said, well, that's roughly 40% of Molokai is saturated, other islands are approaching that same limit, actually. So there are a lot of circuits on Oahu that are saturated, but not as many as a percentage. But that issue has been addressed in a different PUC docket, and there has been a decision in order. And so now the first screen would be 15% of peak demand. If that's we're there already, then they say we measure minimum load at noon on Sunday for solar resources, not for wind, but for solar distributed resources. And you can have 50% of minimum load at noon on Sunday. So peak load occurs from 5 to 8 o'clock at night on most islands. And however, peak solar resources at noon, so they chose noon. Minimum load at noon on Sunday on most circuits is almost the same as peak. And now you're getting 50% of that. So we should effectively triple the penetration limits on all circuits across all islands, with only a few exceptions where there's mostly industrial things going on, and so nothing's operating on Sunday. And that's truly addressing the utilities' technical concern, which was why the whole 15% was there in the first place. It was more to address the exception rather than the norm. And so this is the change that's happening right now. And then, like Henry said, even 50% of minimum load isn't the stopping point, but at least we've now doubled or tripled the space on all of our circuits. What the solar parties are waiting to see is how the utility actually implements that change. Because I know I just got an email today that there was, it's called supplemental review. So you get the 15% screen, you fail that screen, you go to supplemental review, you look at 50% of minimum load at noon on Sunday, and somehow the first project on Maui that did supplemental review was required to do an IRS again. So we're not sure if the utility is actually going to take the intent of this law and run with it the way that we're thinking they should. Molokai is a little different because the U.S. Department of Energy, and I keep repeating myself, paid for an island-wide grid study. So even there should be no way for the utility to obfuscate the truth or the real amount of power that's safe to put on the grid. And it's my belief that you'll be able to double or triple the number of systems you have currently operating on the grid, and then we'll have time to figure out the next stage.
And so I guess real fast, what makes me excited as somebody that's been selling solar on island for a little while is the idea that we have been saturating our circuits, whereas maybe Oahu hasn't been saturating all of their residential circuits. To me, what that tells us is that in terms of a community and residents taking things to our own hands and addressing the problems that exist, that we're doing it. If we're saturating our circuits and 50–60% of our island circuits are already saturated, that means there's a huge amount of residents on island that are moving towards sustainability by installing PV and solar systems on their roof, and that is taking responsibility for our energy future. And I think we should applaud ourselves on this island for taking walking the walk, basically. And I think, Oahu should be that point should be made to Oahu. Until you guys saturate your circuits, don't look to the other islands for your energy. Yeah. And also to represent that Molokai is saturating our circuits, and we're demanding that more circuit space be opened up because we're ready, we're hungry, and we know it's the right thing for our island. And I hope that the community continues to realize that, and we keep walking the walk and talking through our actions. Mahalo.
And we just opened a new Home Depot and a new Lowe's right next to the Iwalei transmission substation, which could handle a lot more load, and those two roofs have no solar because we're relying on your wind.
We'd like to invite the rest of you to interact with the panelists one-on-one as we have to get to the next part of our program. But please join me in thanking them for joining us and sharing their thoughts with us.